The night was quiet in the gated suburban neighborhood, the kind of silence that only comes when people feel too safe for their own good. Streetlights glowed faintly, sprinkling patches of light across manicured lawns and expensive driveways. Inside one of those homes, a black man in his 40s sat calmly on his porch, sipping his late-night tea. His name was Marcus Cole. To the neighbors, he was just another resident, quiet, disciplined, polite when spoken to, but distant. Nobody truly knew him. That was the way he preferred it. What they didn't know was that Marcus was far from ordinary. Behind his calm demeanor, behind the pressed shirts and silent routines, he carried a badge that was feared in corridors of power. Marcus Cole was one of the FBI's most formidable agents, a man whose presence in a room could turn powerful men into trembling confessions. But tonight he wasn't an agent. Tonight, he was simply a black man trying to enjoy the peace he had worked so hard for. The calm didn't last. A set of headlights broke the stillness as a dark SUV rolled slowly into the neighborhood. It stopped just short of Marcus's driveway. The doors opened, and out stepped three men in black tactical gear, badges flashing on cheap lanyards that glimmered under the streetlight. Their vests bore large white letters, HOA Enforcement Police. At first glance, it looked official enough to convince a passerby. But Marcus noticed the details immediately: the mismatched patches, the counterfeit shine of their badges, the nervous way one man gripped his flashlight. These men weren't police. They weren't even real security. They were imposters, and Marcus knew exactly what kind. "Step off the porch," one of them barked, his voice already laced with aggression. "You're under arrest for violating HOA policies." Marcus set his tea down slowly. His face didn't flinch, his breathing didn't change, but his eyes sharpened with the kind of cold focus that had unsettled criminals for decades. He said nothing, simply observing. The leader of the trio stepped closer, puffing up his chest, clearly trying to intimidate. His pale face twisted with contempt as he sneered, "What? You think you don't have to follow the rules because you live here? You think you're above the law?" The irony almost made Marcus laugh. Above the law? No. He had spent his life serving it, protecting it, and punishing those who broke it. But he knew the truth of this moment. This wasn't about homeowners, associations, or neighborhood rules. This was about race, about intimidation, about men who thought a black man sitting peacefully on his porch didn't belong in their world. Neighbors' curtains twitched as faces peeked out from behind glass, watching the scene unfold. Some recorded on their phones, too fearful to intervene. Others whispered in satisfaction, confirming their own prejudices that this neighbor had finally been caught. Marcus could feel their eyes, their judgments, their silence pressing against his back. But he didn't move. He didn't give the imposters the satisfaction of fear. The second man, younger and twitching with reckless energy, pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "We're not going to ask you again," he said. "Stand up, hands behind your back. You're coming with us." Marcus's voice finally broke the silence, calm and measured. "And which statute of federal or state law authorizes the HOA Police to carry out arrests at midnight?" The men shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected him to challenge them so directly. The leader recovered first, snapping, "We don't need to explain ourselves to you. You'll answer to the board." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking on the leader's. It wasn't anger in his gaze. It was something far heavier, a warning carried by years of authority. "You should leave now," he said quietly, but firmly enough that even the night seemed to pause. But they didn't leave. They mistook his restraint for weakness. The third man, standing slightly back, muttered under his breath, "Should have known he'd be trouble." He reached toward his hip, revealing not a regulation weapon, but a poorly concealed handgun. And with that motion, the entire atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a performance of intimidation, now balanced on the edge of real violence. Marcus's mind sharpened instantly. His years of training, his countless confrontations with violent criminals, kicked in like muscle memory. He noted their positions, their weapons, the twitch in the leader's hand, the fear masked by arrogance. Every detail painted the same truth. These weren't just racists with a costume. They were dangerous men, and if he didn't control the situation, someone was going to die tonight. "Last warning," Marcus said, his voice lower now, almost a growl. "Walk away while you still can." The leader smirked, mistaking calm for submission, and stepped onto the porch. He swung his flashlight toward Marcus's face. "You think you're scaring me? You're just another..." The insult never finished. Marcus moved faster than the human eye could comfortably register. In one swift motion, he had the man's wrist twisted, the flashlight clattering to the ground, and the imposter pinned against the porch railing. The man howled in pain, but Marcus's grip was steady, controlled. He wasn't lashing out, he was neutralizing a threat. The other two froze, shocked by the sudden shift. The quiet man they thought would fold was now standing, like a wall they couldn't move. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Marcus finally said, pulling a real badge from his pocket and flashing it toward the men. His voice carried not just authority, but finality. "You've just attempted to assault and impersonate law enforcement against a federal agent. Congratulations, that's a felony." The two men stammered, their confidence draining from their faces. The one with the gun instinctively lowered it, realizing that what they had walked into wasn't intimidation, it was disaster. Neighbors gasped audibly from behind their curtains, their whispers rising like wind. The man Marcus held pinned whimpered, his earlier bravado shattered. "We didn't know," he stuttered. "We didn't know who you were." Marcus leaned in close, his voice cold as steel. "You didn't care who I was. You saw a black man on his porch, and you thought that gave you power. That mistake will cost you everything." Blue and red lights flashed in the distance as real police units, already summoned by Marcus's discreet call, entered the neighborhood. Sirens pierced the silence as the imposter's fate sealed itself. And as the officers swarmed in, neighbors stepped back from their windows, ashamed, though not all. Some turned away with bitterness, refusing to admit what they'd just witnessed. Marcus released the leader into the hands of uniformed officers. He stood tall, unshaken, his calm returning like the tide after a storm. But inside, he carried the weight of the moment. The knowledge that no matter his accomplishments, no matter his rank or reputation, his skin still painted a target. Tonight wasn't just an assault on him as an agent. It was an assault on him as a black man who dared to exist freely. And though the imposters were in handcuffs, Marcus knew this story wasn't over. For every fake badge and coward hiding behind intimidation, there was a deeper sickness in the world. And he, Marcus Cole, had just been reminded that his fight wasn't only in the field. Sometimes the battle came straight to his doorstep. The holding room was stark, with white walls that seemed to echo the shallow breathing of the three. Men now sitting handcuffed at a steel table. The bravado that had fueled them in the darkened streets was gone. Their eyes darted nervously at every sound, every creak of the door, like cornered animals realizing the trap had been theirs all along. And then the door opened and Marcus walked in. No tactical gear, no raised voice, no fury on his face, just the chilling composure of a man who had seen hundreds like them before. He placed a file on the table, sat down across from them, and let the silence hang. Silence was his first weapon. It gnawed at them, stripped away the false armor of arrogance they had carried into his neighborhood. Minutes passed before Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, low, deliberate. "You tried to arrest a federal agent. You impersonated law enforcement, and you brought weapons into a suburban community to intimidate a man sitting on his porch. Tell me, whose idea was it?" The leader, his wrist still sore from Marcus's earlier restraint, tried to find his voice. We weren't trying to hurt you," he said, his words stumbling over themselves. "We just wanted to send a message." Marcus leaned back, folding his arms. "A message," he repeated slowly, the words slicing through the air. "What kind of message requires fake badges and loaded weapons at midnight? What exactly were you telling me or telling anyone who looks like me that night?" The younger man, twitching with nervous energy, blurted out, "You don't belong there. People like you move in and everything changes. The neighborhood's not safe anymore. We were just trying to scare you off." His face flushed, realizing too late how much truth he had just spilled. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He let the words hang heavy, their ugliness filling the sterile room. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a mix of steel and sorrow. "You saw me as a threat because of my skin, not because of anything I did. That's the reality, isn't it?" None of them answered. Shame fought with stubborn pride on their faces, but silence was admission enough. Marcus opened the file in front of him. Inside were photographs, faces of men, women, and children whose lives had been endangered by the same twisted mindset. Hate groups hiding behind titles, fake uniforms, or even neighborhood associations had harassed families like his for decades. He slid the photos across the table. "Do you see these people? They were driven out of their homes. Some beaten. Some worse. Every time you wear a fake badge, every time you threaten someone because you think they don't belong, you carry on that same tradition of hate. You think you're protecting your community, but all you're doing is poisoning it. The leader shifted uncomfortably, trying to summon back a fraction of his earlier arrogance. You think one man can change that? You can't fix what's broken in this country. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes piercing through the man's defiance. No, one man can't fix everything. But one man can make sure people like you answer for your crimes. And tonight that man was me. The words landed like a gavel striking wood. The room fell silent again, the men unable to meet his gaze. For Marcus, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving himself. It was about accountability, about reminding them, and everyone watching, that actions born of hate had consequences. Later that night, Marcus sat alone in his office, the weight of the evening pressing on his shoulders. He stared at his own reflection in the darkened window. He had lived his life in the service of justice, building a reputation that reached far beyond the walls of the bureau. Yet in the quiet corners of his mind, the truth lingered like a shadow. No badge, no rank. No accomplishment could erase the prejudice that followed him into every room. To some, he would always be just a black man who didn't belong. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from his supervisor. Good work tonight. Press is asking for a statement. Marcus sighed. He knew how these stories played out. To the public, the headlines would spin half-truths. Some would see him as a hero. Others would question why he provoked the situation, ignoring the simple fact that he was the victim. The same cycle over and over. But this time, Marcus resolved he would control the story. Not for himself, but for every young black man or woman who would hear it and know they weren't alone. At the press conference the next day, cameras flashed as reporters leaned forward with microphones. Marcus stood behind the podium, the weight of expectation heavy but familiar. He adjusted the microphone and began, his voice steady and deliberate. Last night, 3 individuals attempted to impersonate law enforcement officers in order to intimidate a resident of this community. That resident was me. Their motive was not law. Their motive was not safety. Their motive was hate. Gasps rippled through the room, but Marcus pressed on, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of his lived reality. I have served this country as a federal agent for over 20 years. I have hunted down organized crime, dismantled trafficking rings, and put murderers behind bars. And yet last night, in my own neighborhood, my skin color was enough to make me a target. That is the truth too many in this country live with every day. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing his every word. His voice grew stronger, not with anger but with conviction. But let me be clear, intimidation will not win. Hate will not drive us from our homes, our neighborhoods, or our right to live in dignity. I am not just an FBI agent. I am a black man, a father, a neighbor, and I will not be silenced and I will not be moved. The room erupted in questions, but Marcus stepped back from the podium, refusing to let the frenzy drown out the message. His words weren't for the reporters. They were for the families watching at home, for the young boy who might one day sit on his own porch and wonder if he belonged. After the conference, Marcus walked through the city streets, blending into the crowd. He passed faces of every color, some smiling, some weary, all just trying to make it through another day. For a moment, he let himself feel something rare, a spark of hope. Because every story told, every injustice exposed, was another brick laid on the road to something better. But Marcus also knew reality. The men he had confronted were only symptoms of a deeper sickness, a network of hatred festering quietly beneath the surface. Their arrest had pulled back a corner of the curtain, revealing connections to groups that had long evaded justice. And Marcus, weary as he was, knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something larger. Something that would test not just his skills as an agent, but his resilience as a black man in America. As he returned home that evening, Marcus sat once more on his porch, tea in hand, the quiet settling around him. But this time the silence wasn't the same. The streetlights seemed sharper, the shadows longer, the stillness filled with the echo of what had happened. Yet he sat tall, unbroken, because he knew the truth. No fake badge, no threat, no hate-filled intimidation could take away his place in this world. And in that calm, he prepared himself for the next chapter of the fight, a fight not just for his dignity, but for the dignity of all who refused to bow to fear. The investigation unfolded like peeling, back layers of rot hidden beneath polished wood. What had looked like 3 reckless men in cheap uniforms quickly unraveled into Something larger, darker, and far more organized. Marcus's instincts had been right. No one goes that far, risks felony charges, and waves a gun in front of an FBI agent just for the sake of HOA enforcement. These men were foot soldiers, pawns carrying out orders for people who knew how to stay in the shadows. The files that came across Marcus's desk painted a chilling picture. Online forums filled with coded hate, private groups recruiting disillusioned men, networks that operated behind the thin veil of community safety organizations. The so-called HOA Police was just one branch of a wider movement dedicated to creating fear in neighborhoods, where black families, immigrants, or anyone deemed outsiders dared to live. Marcus had seen this before, in different forms, different uniforms, but always with the same poison at its core. One evening, as Marcus sifted through reports, his phone buzzed with a message from a junior agent. "We found something. You'll want to see this." Hours later, Marcus sat in a darkened surveillance room, eyes fixed on a screen. The feed showed a private meeting in a rundown warehouse, where men in the same fake tactical gear plotted their next operations. Among them were faces Marcus recognized, not just petty criminals, but men who held influence in local councils, even a retired police officer whose career had ended in disgrace. They weren't just trying to intimidate Marcus. They were building a network, trying to enforce their own vision of who belonged in America and who didn't. Marcus felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but a deep weariness mixed with resolve. This was the war he had been fighting his entire career, but now it was personal. They had come to his door, tried to strip him of his humanity in front of his neighbors. And if he let it slide, if he let them fade into the system with nothing but slaps on the wrist, they would rise again, stronger, bolder. The Bureau authorized a full-scale operation, and Marcus was put in charge. Nights turned into weeks as he and his team traced connections, flipped informants, and followed money trails that led from suburban driveways to powerful boardrooms. Every discovery added weight to the case, but also to Marcus's heart. Because for every name on the list, there were families who had suffered silently, afraid to speak out, afraid of being targeted. When the day of the raid finally came, Marcus stood at the front, bulletproof vest strapped on, his team of agents around him. The warehouse doors were forced open and chaos erupted. Shouts, the clash of boots on concrete, the metallic clatter of weapons hitting the ground. Men who had once strutted around in fake uniforms now scrambled like rats as the weight of real justice crashed down upon them. Through the frenzy, Marcus's eyes locked on the leader, the same man who had once stood on his porch with a sneer. He tried to run, but Marcus was faster. Within seconds, the man was on the ground, cuffed, his bravado gone. Marcus leaned down, his voice quiet but unshakable. "I told you that night on my porch, you made a mistake. This is where it ends." The raid dismantled the group, exposing a sprawling conspiracy that stretched far beyond one neighborhood. The story dominated headlines for weeks, sparking national conversations about racial intimidation, hate crimes, and the thin disguises prejudice often wore. Communities across the country reached out, sharing their own stories, their own scars. For many, Marcus became a symbol, not just of law enforcement, but of resilience, of standing tall when the world tried to push you down. But Marcus himself carried the weight differently. In the quiet after the storm, he sat again on his porch, tea in hand, the neighborhood now humming with a cautious respect. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed curtains now nodded politely, some even offering apologies, though Marcus knew words couldn't erase silence. He didn't need their approval. What he needed, what he had always needed, was the knowledge that he had not bowed, that he had not let their hate define him. His phone rang, and this time it was his teenage son, voice filled with pride. "Dad, I saw you on the news. My teacher showed us in class. Everyone was talking about you." Marcus closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. That was the real victory. Not the handcuffs, not the headlines, but the look in his son's eyes when he saw that his father had stood unbroken. For every young black boy who had been told he didn't belong, for every family who had been made to feel like outsiders in their own homes, Marcus's fight meant something bigger. Later that week, at a community forum, Marcus stood once again before a crowd. The auditorium was filled with faces of every color, every age, people who had come not just to hear his story, but to see what it meant for them. He spoke not as an FBI agent, not as a symbol, but as a man who had endured the sting of prejudice and chosen to stand anyway. You see, they thought they could silence me with fear. They thought a fake badge could strip me of my dignity. But here's the truth. No uniform, no intimidation, no lie can erase who we are. We belong. We belong in these neighborhoods, in these schools, in these jobs, in this country. And the moment we stop believing that, the moment we bow to their hate, that's when they win. I will not let them win. And neither should you. The crowd rose in applause, some with tears in their eyes. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. They saw their own battles in his words, their own resilience mirrored in his stance. As the applause faded and Marcus stepped off the stage, he knew the fight was far from over. Hatred didn't vanish with one raid, one arrest, or one speech. It lingered, waiting for cracks to seep through. But he also knew something else. He wasn't fighting alone. Each story told, each injustice exposed, each refusal to bow to intimidation added strength to the collective fight. That night, back on his porch under the glow of the streetlight, Marcus allowed himself a rare smile. The world would keep testing him, keep reminding him of the weight he carried as a black man in America. But he would keep standing. Not because he was fearless, but because he knew fear couldn't dictate his life. Because dignity was not something anyone could take. It was something he carried. Something he passed on, something that lived in the very act of refusing to bow. And so, the man they had tried to arrest with fake badges sat calmly with his tea, more unshakable than ever. Not just an FBI agent, not just a symbol, but a man who had claimed his place and would never give it back. The night was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the fragile silence of false safety. It was the strong, unbroken silence of a man who had faced down hate and reminded the world he belonged.